Hello and welcome to another video review. This is The Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings Enhanced Edition for PC, Mac, Linux, and Xbox 360. This is an action RPG by CD Projekt RED that was released originally in May of 2011 for PC, and then it later saw release as the Enhanced Edition in April of 2012, which was for PC and Xbox 360, and it later came to Mac and Linux as well. It is of course the sequel to The Witcher, which was a video game based on the fantasy novels by the Polish author who I want to say is Andrzej Sapkowski, but I do not know how to pronounce that because I'm not Polish, nor do I speak Polish. So, if you're Polish or you speak Polish, feel free to correct me on that. It did also get a very good reception on its release, with numerous awards and very high scores across the board, and generally you don't see people complaining about this game. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which I'll get to more in a moment. But one of the sort of side reasons to this is CD Projekt's way of handling the Enhanced Edition in particular, but also just content updates in general, where the Xbox 360 version of the game was always the Enhanced Edition, but the PC version was a free update. And so this is something that they did with the original Witcher game as well, where the Enhanced Edition of that was a free update as well. But they did it again with Witcher 2, and they basically took some of the criticisms from the original release of the game and changed things up when they got to the Enhanced Edition and tried to improve upon some of the things that critics didn't particularly like about it, namely the fairly weak third chapter of the game. But ultimately, the question here is, how does this thing measure up to not only its previous game, but everything else on the market? Because there aren't all that many big games to come out of Poland, and especially games that come out of Poland and receive widespread success across the world. So, how does The Witcher 2 stack up? Well, in terms of presentation, it is not remotely fair to compare this to the original game, because it is leaps and bounds ahead of that. And even to this day, this game is pretty gorgeous. It has immense amounts of detail and everything, and they put a huge amount of effort into even the smallest details to make this thing really pop and come alive. What you're seeing is the visuals maxed out, but at my native resolution, which is not actually 1080p, it's 720p at the most. So you're not getting the full resolution, so to speak. But even then, you can very easily tell that this thing is very visually impressive. And it looks way better in person, because let's face it, YouTube compression is not going to actually show you the real visuals of the game. The modeling is extremely detailed, and the textures are also very, very well done, with the only real blemish being some of the animations. By and large, they're very smooth, fluid, and detailed. But there's occasional hitches and glitches with the animations, particularly when you're going from one into another, where, for example, with movement, if you're trying to jump around where you have to hop up on ledges and climb up and things like that, that tends to be very abrupt. But if you're just running around on the ground and looking around, fighting, that sort of thing, the animations chain together very well. The other issue with the animations is some of the facial animations, not all of them, namely the lip syncing. It's not exact. Now, it's still very well done for the most part, but there's moments here and there where it very much looks like a video game lip sync and not so much a real person talking. But that's basically just nitpicking, because this thing looks extremely good, and I've actually managed to get this thing running on hardware that probably should not have been able to run it very well. On my 8800 GT, actually, it still managed to perform very well despite that thing being relatively underpowered. Now that I've got the new rig, of course, I can max it out and have basically no problems whatsoever. But even back then, on that 8800 GT with just a dual-core processor, it was pretty impressive how this thing scaled so well. So, if you're looking at this and going, oh, I couldn't possibly run that, give it a shot. You might be surprised. It has a huge array of options in the launcher, which that's where you had to edit all your graphics things, which I wish they could do that in-game. That'd be much better. But the amount of options they give you in the launcher kind of makes up for that. So it's very easy to tweak it to your exact hardware specifications and make it look very, very good and still perform very well. And then there's the sound design. Now, I do have some issues with the voice acting, mostly because the English dub is not as good as the Polish. Now that stands to reason because, let's face it, it's a Polish game based on Polish fantasy novels. And so of course it's going to not only resonate a lot more with the Polish, they're going to be able to get that nuance that you can't get with a translation. And so while the English voiceovers are generally very good, with the exception of a couple here and there, sometimes Triss sounds really robotic compared to pretty much everybody else. But that's only sometimes, not all the time. And some of the other actors kind of ham it up a bit, but by and large they've done a good job with voiceovers on the English side of things. But the Polish voiceovers are just so much better. Luckily you can actually switch over to Polish voiceovers with English subtitles. And so that makes it a lot more enjoyable, and that's something I've actually liked a lot about more recent games that come from other places than English-speaking countries. For example, Japanese games have done this for a while, where they'll have Japanese voiceovers but English subtitles. And so you get all of the nuance of the Japanese voiceovers, and you can feel that subconsciously, even if you can't understand it, and yet you get the translation in the English subtitles, and it still makes sense to what's going on. So that sort of thing is very nice to have, and it's very well appreciated, especially since they have so many language options available. It has, for example, Chinese subtitles of all things. So if your English skills are not particularly great, or you're just not a native English speaker and would prefer to hear it in a different language or whatever, give the other languages a shot and see if there's anything that fits you better, because there are quite a few options. At any rate, that's only one facet of the sound design. The rest of the sound design is also pretty solid, with some very beefy sound effects that are all very, very good in their context, and some music that is this kind of sweeping orchestral stuff with the occasional hint of this sort of Polish or Eastern European vibe. Now, that's something that I feel like they could have expanded a lot more on, and when it does happen in this, it actually makes the sound very unique instead of just kind of generic epic fantasy. And what we're seeing with The Witcher 3 is that they pretty much understood that and are now very heavily incorporating this kind of Eastern European vibe to the music. So they kind of learned from their mistake already. It's not a mistake in a huge sense. It's just kind of a missed opportunity with Witcher 2, because the music is still very, very good. It's just that, like I said, some of the music does come across as a bit generic. But as fantastic as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you are once again Geralt of Rivia, the Witcher that was your protagonist in the previous game, as well as the protagonist of the novels. And this takes place after the events of the original Witcher game, which of course took place after the events of the novels. And in the previous game, so you have a bit of a recap here, he had lost his memory and was trying to piece it back together while doing all sorts of different things in the original game, which I'm not going to go over here. But when you get to this one, you find that Geralt has been thrown in prison because he's suspected of assassinating King Foltest of Temeria. And when you go through the course of the prologue, you actually get to look through the eyes of Geralt as he witnesses the king being slain in front of him. And from there, you have to get out of prison and then eventually track down the Kingslayer. But it gets a lot more complicated once you get Geralt out of prison, and things always get more complicated in the world of The Witcher, where you find out that the actual Kingslayer was in cahoots with the Scoia'tael, which is basically a rebel elf organization. If you're not familiar with the world of The Witcher at all, I really highly recommend playing the first game before you play this one, because that really does set up the world a lot better, where it's pretty much assumed in this one that you know what things are. It still will explain them to you if you actually go into the journal and look around and things like that, but there's not really a lot of world-building exposition, so you do have to kind of dig around to figure things out if you don't know anything already. And if you've read the novels, that's a lot better, because, let's face it, this thing is based on the novels, and there's a lot of references to things in the novels. So people who've read those will get a hell of a lot more out of this game than people who haven't. That said, once it introduces the Scoia'tael under Yorveth and the Blue Stripes under Vernon Roche, it becomes a mostly self-contained storyline that is fairly easy to follow, although still pretty complex. And I don't really want to spoil too much of it, but suffice to say, in Chapter 1 you're basically getting all of the groundwork, but when you get to Chapter 2, you've made the decision that will really influence the way the story plays out. Because there's basically two major paths in this game, depending on what side you decide to join. And things can play out pretty radically different depending on what you chose. And when you actually go through this game, you find that one of the biggest strengths of the writing is its kind of ambiguity. Much like in both the novels and the previous Witcher game, there isn't a lot of black and white in this game. I mean, you do have some binary paths to quest lines and such like that, but the outcomes are not necessarily obvious. And things you do in Chapter 1 can pretty radically influence the things that play out in Chapter 3, which is the end game, basically. So you find that pretty much all the major choices are in Chapter 1 and very early parts of Chapter 2. And by the time you get to Chapter 3, you're finally seeing all of your choices really come to fruition. And not necessarily in the way you hoped. And one major thing about this is that it's a pretty realistic fantasy setting. Where, sure, there's magic, sure, there's monsters, there's all sorts of crazy things like that, but people are still people. And people can often be complete scumbags. And that's something you have to keep in mind when you're playing this thing. You don't necessarily look at this thing as a standard fantasy RPG, where you can pretty much predict things that happen. In this, some things you can predict. But by and large, if you play this thing like a standard fantasy RPG and you want to be, say, a goody two-shoes or something, that can bite you in the ass pretty often. And it's this kind of ambiguity, and not only its ambiguity, but the way that the characters are very well fleshed out for the most part, that really binds the story together and makes it really interesting to go through. That said, there is one major letdown, and that is the ending. And it highlights something that's pretty major. The game feels like a transition piece. It feels kind of like Mass Effect 2 in the sense of it's there to bridge the gap between The Witcher 1 and The Witcher 3. Where the first game set up pretty much everything, and then the third game concludes everything. And so, when you get to the ending of The Witcher 2, a lot of things are kind of left unanswered. There's threads that are just kind of left dangling, and you feel like they could be picked up pretty easily with the events of The Witcher 3. And what we've seen from the pre-release stuff is that they're trying to incorporate as much of that as they possibly can. So we'll have to wait until The Witcher 3 to really see how all of this plays out, but The Witcher 2 itself ends on a fairly decent cliffhanger and leaves you going, well, there's a lot of stuff that's unanswered here. Hopefully they'll get to it in The Witcher 3. So the story is very interesting up until the ending, which is just a bit disappointing. But how's the gameplay? Well, the first thing you'll notice is that this plays pretty much nothing at all like the original Witcher game, which, admittedly, the gameplay was not that game's strong suit. This time around, however, they've done a lot to make it a lot more of a traditional action RPG in a lot of ways. So you have a lot of stats under the hood, and if you enable the combat tracker thing, it will actually show you what kind of damage you're doing, what types of damage, whether things were absorbed, or so on and so forth. So there's a fair bit of feedback as to what's actually going on under the hood, even though it doesn't really explicitly tell you everything. And something you'll find very, very quickly is that this is definitely a European RPG at heart. You may be wondering what that means. Well, if you've played Gothic, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. This game is not easy, by any stretch of the imagination. I played through it on normal difficulty. There are 2 settings higher than that, and I regularly got my ass handed to me. And even when I got to the end game, where I was just a complete badass in terms of all my stats and everything, I still got annihilated pretty easily, so it never really gets easy. Now, certain enemies are going to be easier than others. You've seen me just kind of slaughter the harpies incredibly easily. That was because they're not particularly difficult enemies. That said, some enemies are tougher than others, and particularly when you get to the big stuff that you're fighting for big quest lines and such like that, you're going to find that they will pretty easily hand you your ass if you do not prepare. And preparation is a very big thing in this game. You got to have the right tools for the job. Now, when you get later in the game and you've actually leveled up considerably and actually have some very badass stats, you'll find that you can get away a lot more with just using your swordplay. But if you're early on especially, you're going to want to lay traps, you're going to want to use a lot of like explosives or other throwables. You're going to want to be very, very careful with how you do things. And even by the end game, all of that stuff is still very valid and still very useful. You also have a variety of signs that you have at your disposal, where you can use 2 at a given time, where you see this small bar, which is split into 2 sections at the top left of the screen, right under the health bar. And it tells you exactly when you can use your signs. If you don't have any segments of the bar filled, then you don't actually get to use any of your signs. And as you'll level up, you'll find that eventually you can get access to more bits of that bar so you can actually use more signs. But you also get better versions of the signs that you have, where they'll do more damage, or they'll do more damage negation, or things like that. The Quen sign, for example, which is that kind of lightning shield you see me using on occasion. In fact, I use it pretty often. If you have it at its lowest level, it basically just negates damage. But if you have it leveled up, then you can actually have it to where when an enemy hits you, not only does it negate the damage, it will zap them. And so there's this very definite feeling of progression. As you're going through the game, you are getting more and more powerful, and you definitely feel it. But at the same time, you never feel like the game is being too easy on you. You always feel like there is a challenge somewhere. And eventually, certain enemies will just stop giving you experience points altogether, even if they're still not that easy to take down, just because they're considered fairly low level or something. So it's an interesting way of doing the difficulty, and while I do like it, sometimes it can feel a bit unfair in the very earliest parts of the game, where you have to be careful on a degree that rivals and almost, not quite, but almost is higher than Gothic levels of being careful and prepared and everything. And so you'll probably want to go on as many side quests as you possibly can. Most of the time you'll find these on the notice boards scattered throughout the various settlements. Now, when you get to the first settlement of the game, you're in Flotsam, and you go to the notice board and you find that there's a bunch of Witcher contracts. They can be for things like the Necker contract or the Endrika contract or something like that. And what you find is that they're basically monster hunts, where you have to go and root out the monsters, slaughter them, and then, if you're in the case of the Necker contract, destroy their nests so they don't respawn and things like that. And you'll get some decent rewards for doing so, not just in experience points, but also monetary rewards, item rewards, things like that. And when you get later on in the game, you'll find that some of these contracts are very, very good to do, not just because of the reward of completing the contract itself, but because you'll find things during these contracts that will actually open up other side quests. And that gets pretty interesting, the way that they work exploration in this game, considering that this is a fairly linear game. So you can't really go around exploring a huge open world, but when you go on these side quests, they'll open up more opportunities for actually finding new things and exploring and things like that. So you don't feel like it's as linear as it actually is, and that's a very good thing. It feels like you have some freedom to roam around and do things. Not to mention that several side quests have multiple outcomes depending on your choices throughout the quest. So there is some replay value there, and it does make things pretty interesting when you're actually going through the game. But there are a few fairly annoying bugbears to contend with in this thing. The first of them being that, especially early on, the combat gets fairly tedious. Now this is mostly because at that stage of the game you're still pretty weak and you don't have access to a lot of the more advanced maneuvers that you get later on in the game. And so you don't feel like a complete badass at that point. So you might end up dying multiple times on a single side quest or just in a fairly simple fight or something like that. And it can get kind of annoying. It's not a deal breaker necessarily, but it is something you have to keep in mind and be patient with. When you get later on in the game and you get access to, for example, the advanced roll, which allows you to move much further away from enemies, then it gets a lot better about that. Where no longer do you feel like a complete wimp, and now you can actually deal with the situation at hand. It's never particularly easy, of course, but it certainly gets a lot more manageable later on in the game. It's basically once you get out of the entry-level stuff, once you get to around level 10 or so, where you've maxed out everything on the basic training tree, which is actually required to advance to the other more advanced trees, and you actually start getting into the more advanced stuff where you're really getting a lot more bonuses for, say, swordsmanship, or for alchemy, or for your signs. So that's when the game really picks up and becomes a lot more enjoyable. But up until then, it can feel like a bit of a slog. But luckily it doesn't take wildly long to get to the point where you actually don't feel like a complete wimp anymore. So there is that. There are some other issues that you'll find with regards to, for example, the combat. It's mostly an issue of getting used to how combat works out, because you don't actually regenerate your health while you're fighting unless you're using a potion called Swallow. And when you're actually fighting, your health can go down very, very quickly, because enemies hit pretty hard. Even later on in the game, when you're just fighting normal enemies, they will still actually hit very hard. And if you don't pay attention to what you're doing, you can still get your ass handed to you. But that said, especially early on, that's going to become a lot more important. And so it becomes a matter of, did you prepare for this fight beforehand, in that you knew you were going to have a fight, and so you stocked up on your potions and everything, and now you're actually ready to go. Well, if you weren't expecting a fight, then you probably weren't prepared for one. And since these potions wear off after a while, you kinda need to have a lot of potions on hand. Which in turn can be kind of annoying, because at least some of the potions are pretty easy to get ingredients for. For example, the potion for healing is not at all hard to get your hands on ingredients for. But some of the more advanced stuff, the stuff that you might really like to have for certain battles, if you want to make certain oils or things like that to enhance your equipment for a fight ahead. For example, if you want to take on an Indriga Queen pretty early on, one of the things you're going to want to do is put insectoid oil on your blade so that it'll actually do a lot more damage to that specific enemy. So if you want to do something like that, you might actually need some fairly rare ingredients, and that can be kind of annoying to deal with if you just don't have access to them. But slightly more annoying is the manner in which you actually take these potions, where you actually have to open up the meditation menu, which requires you to not be in combat. So you can't actually take potions in the middle of a fight, and you have to keep an eye on your toxicity level. If you use too many potions, then your toxicity level gets too high, and you actually suffer some drawbacks from that. So what ends up happening is that there's this kind of delicate balance where there's only 3 potions you can have at any given point when you're actually just taking potions. And while they do have timed effects, and when the timed effect goes away, the toxicity goes away, you have to keep an eye on what you're doing. And the thing that the game is constantly drilling in your head is moderation and patience. So it basically goes against every idea that the current casual gamer knows. It is the exact opposite of the Skyrim mentality, where you just run in swinging your sword around like an idiot and you come out without a scratch because the game's just too easy. This time around, it punishes you actively if you try to do stupid stuff. And if you've gotten too used to doing stupid stuff, then you're probably going to get pissed off by the game. It's just a fact. That said, the way that you heal as well as the scarcity of certain ingredients is not necessarily a deal breaker. You can work around stuff like that. But my biggest bugbear with this game are the couple of stealth segments. The stealth system in this game is downright terrible. When you're actually in a segment where you have to sneak around, Geralt automatically goes into this sort of slow-moving crouch. And if you're spotted, all hell breaks loose. So, in certain situations, if it's just a matter of, well, sneaking makes it a bit easier, so to speak, okay, so be it. But there's actually at least one segment of the game where you are forced into stealth and you can't be spotted lest you basically screw up your attempts at actually getting stuff done. And it's in that particular instance where the problem of the stealth system and how rudimentary it is really does come into play. You can sneak up behind enemies and knock them out, but it doesn't always work. And that gets kind of annoying, because you'll sneak up behind a guy and it'll pull up a button prompt for you to do. And it may or may not trigger. Usually it does, but on occasion I've found some weird glitches where it didn't. And that got infuriating when I actually was trying to go through this segment the first time. It was eventually fixed for sure, but when I was trying to do it the first time, it just wouldn't always trigger, and they would just turn around and spot me instantly. And it was just like, well, crap. It took me so many tries to get through that segment that it just infuriated me. But luckily, that's a fairly small part of the game. It only brings up stealth a couple of times in the game. Another issue I have is that you don't get enough level ups to really be able to max out your skill tree. So you basically have to pick a single skill tree, for example, swordsmanship, and stick with it the entire game, and put all of your points into that. Because you only get 1 point per level up, basically. And each point corresponds to a single bit on the skill tree. Some skills are a lot more useful than others. For example, I didn't even bother with the alchemy skill tree at all. Some people might focus a lot more on that because they're playing on a higher difficulty setting, or they're using a lot more of the potions, a lot more of the craftable throwing items and things like that, and not so much of the swordsmanship like I use. I used a very heavy combination of signs and swordsmanship, mostly swordsmanship, and so I tailored my skills to that strength. So you can really only max out one skill tree and get a pretty decent thing going with a second skill tree, but you basically have to pick 2 and stick with them. So if you were hoping to be able to be the ultimate badass by the end of the game, it's pretty much not going to happen. At least not on normal difficulty. It may well work on dark mode, but I didn't play dark mode. That's the hardest difficulty in the game. And given how difficult this thing is by itself, I didn't even want to attempt dark mode, so kudos to you if you managed to complete that. But your mileage may vary on that, and your playstyle may vary. Some people are just more into the side weapons than the swordsmanship. And I can understand that, because the swordsmanship is fairly simple. You have a block button, which doesn't actually completely negate damage, it just reduces it. And it'll throw the enemy off balance a little bit. You have a heavy attack, you have a light attack, and you have a dodge button. And that's kind of it. You also have a button to throw your secondary weapon, and you can switch between your steel sword and your silver sword. Silver sword is better for supernatural targets, and steel sword is better for just normal humans and normal animals and things like that. And so you can upgrade these over time by adding runes, and you can, of course, craft new weapons with all sorts of materials throughout the world. This is another issue I had, but it's mostly a nitpick, where I actually ended up filling up my inventory with crafting items. And that just got annoying because I would end up actually going over the weight limit because I just had too much of, say, iron ore or something like that, where you just find it all over the place and you don't really think all that much of picking it up, but then you find that you're over encumbered and you can't actually carry it around. So it's like, well, crap. But again, that's a nitpick, because I just got so into that crafting system where I was just constantly like, okay, let's craft new weapons, let's craft new armor and things like that. But again, your mileage may vary. But to conclude my bit about the combat, I do feel like it's something they could definitely improve in the sequel, to where it could flow better, because sometimes you can just stop in your tracks and it gets kind of annoying, and sometimes you'll get too heavily going in a combo and just get your ass handed to you. There's not a lot of feedback for actually being hit. You just watch your health bar go down. And so that's something they really need to improve, to where they make it obvious that you just took damage. Maybe your screen flashes red, or there's a hit marker to pop up to show you what direction the hit came from, and so you actually know what's going on, instead of just taking the damage and then eventually dying because you couldn't actually pay attention to what was going on. And another thing they really needed to improve is the size of the interface. As you can see, it is very small on the screen, and that's another reason why I couldn't always tell when I was going to die or not, because the health bar is such a tiny portion of the screen, you kind of forget it's there. And so that makes it just that much harder to actually understand how much damage you're taking at any given point. So I can understand completely why people would avoid putting all of their stuff into the swordsmanship tree, for example. I really like doing that, but other people might not, just because they feel like they get more out of the sub-weapons and the signs. It's still a pretty dynamic and interesting combat system, but it could have been done a lot better. At least it's way better than what they had in the previous Witcher game, which was just terrible. Let's face it, the combat in The Witcher 1 was awful. There's no denying that. This is a lot better. It's not perfect, but it's just a lot better. And so you find that that's kind of the general philosophy with this game. It's a lot better than The Witcher 1, but it's not perfect. It has plenty of issues. Whether they're deal breakers or not really is a very subjective thing. For me, most of the problems were not really deal breakers. I could see where a couple of them might be, and maybe it's just the fact that I got used to games like Gothic and Risen, where patience and preparation are really important. But none of the issues were really deal breakers, regardless of how annoyed I actually got with them at that time. Usually it was pretty easy to cool down after the irritation had passed and just be like, okay, well, the rest of this game is really getting me into the world, and the writing is really very strong here, so it's more than enough to make up for that. And I do feel like they could have expanded on side activities a bit more side quests that were not just Witcher contracts, for example, more side stories and things like that. And I felt like the side games and such that they included with arm wrestling, for example, was just awful. It's basically just keep your cursor within the bar, and if you don't, then you lose. And the dice minigame is not particularly good either, but hey, they're minigames. If you're into that sort of thing, then you can certainly go in with those and get something out of them. I personally didn't care for them all that much, but again, your mileage may vary. And there is one thing that got pretty annoying with this game that nobody likes, and that's QuickTime events. It does have QuickTime events. Luckily, they get fewer and further between the further you get into the game, but still, it just feels like they've had to include that because that's just kind of the thing to do now. And with the rest of the game not being like that, it felt kind of jarring. But that's not a deal breaker either. Ultimately, The Witcher 2 is a very strong action RPG. It's not for everyone, that's for sure, but it's definitely better than the original game in a lot of ways. It's not perfect, but it's still well worth picking up, especially if you're a fan of the actual novels or you like the original game, but you felt like it could have been improved. And with Witcher 3 coming up, it's probably a very good idea to play through this thing so you actually understand what's going on when you get to The Witcher 3. Just remember that you'll probably get the most out of it if you read the novels like I do. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.